Exodus 12, verse 37. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot, that were men besides children. And a mixed multitude went up with them as well, and flocks and herds and very much cattle. You know, you sit down and you read the Bible, you just read along, you read a statement like that, keep on going, and I don't think very often the magnitude of what's happening here sinks in on us. I thought I'd do a little math. You know, conservatively, and I'm being extremely, much more conservative than some others have been, that's 1.5 million human beings, something close to it. Because the 600,000 figure is basically fighting men's age, something between 20 and 40. So you've got old men, old women, you've got children, you've got babes in arms. If you take 1.5 million of them and you spread them out, stand them up in ranks, let's say for an assembly, each person taking up about 9 square feet, 3 feet on a side, they will cover something in excess, all those will, about 600 acres. I'm sorry, 300 acres, a little over 300 acres. If they have to lie down and take a nap, you've gone all of a sudden to something like 600 acres very quickly. But no migrating people would ever be that tightly ranked. And it makes no allowance for cows, for sheep, and they had a lot of animals with them on this trip. My guess is that the people alone would have occupied close to a square mile. Now, another one said conservatively he estimated it at 2 million people based upon the population estimates that there would have been at the time. If you do a little math on this, if you had a square mile full of people and you start marching them out of Egypt, if their column was 1/4 mile wide at the front, it would extend back about 8 miles. I think it's very reasonable to think you had a column of something like 6 to 10 miles, depending upon circumstances and terrain that they were going through. And actually going directly west from Goshen, the land there is pretty flat, so they could have spread out easily over a 1/2 mile front, which would have only gone back about 4 miles. But then, and so it goes as you spread these people out. And, of course, someone was telling me that whenever you all lined up in a platoon to do your cross-country march, it's one of these forced marches about 20 miles in a day, by the time you get to the other end of this, everybody's strung out. There are some people who have a longer stride than others, some people a little slower than others. And that with a bunch of civilians who are untrained, they would have been straggling, all over the place in this situation. Now, I will say one thing, though. These people were far more used to walking than we are. We all jumped in our cars and drove over here today, but they walked everywhere they went, and that has a considerable difference on your strength and your ability to cover the ground. I think, as I say, they might have stretched out for a while, but the differences in walking speeds and stamina, I think, a 4-mile long column is more than reasonable, and maybe longer than that when you count the numbers that are there. It must have been an awesome sight. I'm trying to recall, it's been so long since I've seen the movie, The Ten Commandments, that I can't really visualize how they showed the crowds. Cecil B. DeMille was an expert at getting huge numbers of people together. And nowadays, today, with the computer-generated special effects, we can create an army like that. But I think in Lord of the Rings, they had some incredible scenes of numbers of people. It must have been awesome. Now, why Ramses to Succoth is an interesting question. That's the first step that we seem to have on this. My guess is that Succoth, which means booths, was either the place of their first camp, or it was the assembly place. One commentary suggested it was the assembly place because they were scattered all over Goshen, and the instructions would have been, we all move from wherever we are to Succoth. The thing about it is the word Succoth is the word for the tabernacle or a booth, and which in turn derives its name from the living in tabernacles on the road through the wilderness. It's not by no means certain that place even had that name up until this time. But still, it could have been the assembly point. The problem with it being the first day's march is that from Ramses to Succoth on most biblical maps is 25 miles. And you're not going to move that volume of people that far in one day, and it's just not going to happen. I think that is those distances are difficult because, in fact, as one source pointed out, no one really knows where most of those place names were. They were probably, in many cases, the name given to the place came about because Israel was there. And consequently, when they were there one night or two nights and they moved on, there was not much left for there to be for archaeologists to go in, discover, find, or even have a clue where it was. So I think, looking at this type of thing, these people were, making some progress, but how much and how fast could they have gone? The organization must have been impressive. Communication, how in the world do you communicate without any electronics, no cell phones, none of that stuff, with nearly 2 million people spread out over all this area and get them to move together, to move in the same direction? It's impressive to see what they did. I'm sure if we were able, we would be even more impressed if we knew how they did it. But they, being used to, as they were, not having to do with cell phones, not having to get along with telephones, nothing of that nature, they had their ways, and they probably had ways of getting it done. Well, Exodus 13 begins in verse 3 by saying, Moses said to the people, remember this day. Boy, would they ever forget it. Remember this day you came out of Egypt from the house of bondage, for by the strength of hand the Lord brought you out from this place. There shall no leavened bread be eaten. This day you came out in the month of Abib. And it shall be when the Lord shall bring you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, that he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. And I think it must be, surely is, the oldest known religious observance in the history of any people. It goes back, to this tremendous event. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. The seventh day shall be a feast to the Lord. And sure enough, here we are on the seventh day, keeping a feast to God. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days. There shall no leavened bread be seen with you. Neither shall there be leaven seen with you in all your quarters. And you shall show your son in that day. This is done because of what the Lord did to me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be a sign unto you upon your hand for a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand has the Lord brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. You read that, and here it's sort of placed in the first person. You will tell your son, the reason we're doing this is because I was a slave in Egypt, and God brought me out of slavery. This is the first generation. And the second generation, you tell your son, God brought your grandfather out of Egypt with a high hand and carried us into this good land that he has given you. And then you tell the third generation, the fourth generation, the fifth generation. And, it is really in a way amazing that the Jewish people have managed to keep this ceremony, this observance intact for all these generations. How many? Since the event took place. Exodus 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, even though that was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return into Egypt. Interesting thought. Now, if you've got a Bible map that has the route of the Exodus anywhere in it, and you look at from Ramses to Succoth, the direction is southeast. It's more or less in the direction of the top of the Red Sea. And you look at the map and see, well, where is Palestine? Where's the Holy Land? Well, it is east and then northeast a little bit. So why did they go in that direction? The answer seems to be that God says if they have to go through the Philistines, they'll have to fight their way through, and they may not be willing to fight those battles. So I don't want them changing their mind. I don't want them going back, so we'll start off down this direction. So he led them around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph made him swear by an oath, surely God will come to your aid, and you must carry my bones with you from this place. That's really a charge to give to your children, saying, I know one of these days we're all going to go home, and I want to go with you. don't leave my bones buried in Egypt. And in the movie, I recall, some gentlemen going along with this bier on their shoulders, that is Joseph, and they're carrying him out of Egypt back toward Palestine. So after leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. Now you sort of think, well, I guess this is night 2. Bible atlases, though, have Etham some 50 miles from Ramses, and there's no way that they made that distance in just 2 days. Fact is, as I said, very little is known with any certainty of these location of these place names. You know the general direction they went. You know the name that was placed on it at the time, a name which probably vanished into history after the Israelites left there. Now, I did a little research on cattle drives. A very good day for a cattle drive would be about 8 miles. And that's with 400 longhorns and 12 cowboys on horseback along the old Chisholm Trail. That's what they did just, I think, last year with a drive that originated somewhere down here in Texas. And this is the length, based on the length of time it took them to get it from the Red River all the way to where they were going in Kansas. The number of miles and the days that were involved in it. And you look at that, you think, well, 8 miles a day with 400 longhorns, and then the chuck wagon would go on ahead of them and set up camp, and they'd have supper waiting for them when they got there. So already you'd probably expect them to make pretty good time. 8 miles per day. The distance from Ramses to Sinai, and I had a hard time getting this worked out. My Bible Atlas wasn't working right, the computer one. I think it is 210 miles as the crow flies. It's at least 250, maybe closer to 300 miles on the ground. With 6 miles a day, 6 days a week, they would arrive at Mount Sinai, the traditional Mount Sinai, pretty close to Pentecost, which is the time where they received the Ten Commandments on the 6th of Sivan, the 6th day of the 3rd month, which for Jews tends to be Pentecost. And probably for the years until they entered the land, that calendar date probably served because there were no first fruits in the wilderness. So this is the reason why, if you go looking at Jewish websites about Shavuot, what we call Pentecost, it always has to do with the giving of the commandments and, incidentally, first fruits. With us, because of Christ, it is first fruits, incidentally, giving of the Ten Commandments. So, the idea of Mount Sinai being further than that seems pretty remote to me. In fact, I saw another map that actually assumed that while they didn't go straight up the road through the Philistines, they went a much more northerly route, and they sort of speculated on Mount Sinai as being a slightly smaller mountain somewhere in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula that they would have made in a little bit easier. And so this is all very, very tight and also very, very, very much an approximation. Now, none of this is all that important. It just gives us a feel for what was happening and the challenges that these people faced. Imagine, keeping 2 million people in the march, in the same direction, following along with one another. And, of course, I don't know, maybe they were so tired at the end of every day they didn't have time to fight or bicker or argue, and it might have been a help in keeping the peace. Exodus 14, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. I want them to camp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon." Now, Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around by the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Now, this is obviously going to entail some delays, because he had Israel change the direction of march, again, and took them right down to the bank of the Red Sea and had them there. The idea was Pharaoh's scouts would say, they are right down there, they are trapped. They can't go south. The sea is on that side. We've got them. We can bring them back. So, the king of Israel told this. He and his officials changed their minds and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready, took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen with troops, pursued the Israelites, and they overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon. Both of these place names are not known to anyone nowadays. I think I have been there. We, on one of our first trip to the Middle East, learned of an American woman who was living in Cairo with her husband who was working on oil wells, I believe, in Egypt, and she had requested baptism if ever anybody was in the area who could do so. So Allie and I met her in the Hilton Hotel in Cairo. We sat down, talked about baptism, and decided that she really should be baptized. And my question was, well, how are we going to do this? Well, she borrowed her husband's Volkswagen, and we had a choice. We could drive up to Alexandria and baptize her in the Mediterranean, or we could motor over to Suez and a little south and baptize her in the Red Sea. We decided on the Red Sea. South and west of us, as we got down there, and this was really obvious as you got there, we drove to Suez, saw the ships in the canal, turned south down along the thing. We came to a place down there where there was a public beach. And it was interesting, the topography was there because everything about it was really kind of designed to funnel you into an area where there was nowhere to go. The road went this far, but if you went any further south, you went into hills and then mountains and all this, and there was desert down there. There was no reason for anybody to go down, and it would be very difficult for anybody who headed down that direction, especially back in the old days. You would have been, if you had brought 1.5 million people down into that general area, they would have been well and truly trapped there with no place to go except the mountains or the sea. So here you are. When I got down there, I found I had south and west of me, there were desolate mountains. West of me was the sea, east of me was the sea, and northeast would have been Pharaoh's army. Well, we baptized that lady on that day, and it was a real memorable thing for me. I know I'll never forget it because of the remark that is made of how Israel was baptized in the Red Sea and coming out of Egypt and coming across there. I don't know if that was the place where Israel crossed or not, but looking at it from a point of view of topography, it sure felt right. And I suspect to this day that we actually baptized that lady right in the right spot for this to have happened. The impression you get just reading it is that this camp was on the third night. But I'm not sure that we should follow that idea strictly. I think the Bible is giving you a hop, skip, and a jump through the story, and there's a little more to it than that. So here we are now at the banks of the Red Sea. Exodus 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out in the desert to die? What have you done to us bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let's go ahead and serve the Egyptians'? It had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Oh, desperate people, the cries of desperate people, it's not particularly surprising. Moses answered the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. All you have to do is be still." And the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." That's the funniest thing I've heard. Move on where? Because there's mountains, there's sea, there are the Egyptians. Well, God said, Exodus 14, verse 16, "Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters, so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They will follow you right down into there. With his army, through his chariots, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh, all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of the Lord, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. Now they have got a rear guard. And it said he came between the armies of Egypt and Israel, and throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. Now I want you to think about something here. We'll talk about it more later. Moses stretched out his hand. He was told to do this. Stretch your hand out. And this was the sign of the dividing of the waters. Okay. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and it went back. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And good old Cecil B. DeMille, that's just exactly the way he presented it to us in the movie. He didn't play any games, didn't try to find some way of explaining it away. He said, wall of water on the right, wall of water on the left, so it shall be. And the Egyptians followed them. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. Don't know exactly what he did. Don't know exactly how he caused it. But once they got down in the bottom of the sea, everything went south on them. The chariot wheels started coming off. They started getting confused about where they were and where they were going. They had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. Because basically the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. One thing you should know there, the Egyptians knew the name. Because what they said was, Jehovah is fighting for the Israelites against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen. Now again, why is Moses stretching his hand out in order that this happens? Because it could have just happened. They're out. The Israelites are all out. The Lord says to an angel, okay, break loose with the water, and it comes down, and that's that. But no, Moses stretched out his hand, and the waters closed over them. Well, anyway, Moses stretched out his hand, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back, covered the chariots and the horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Egyptians into the sea, not one of them survived. The movie is wrong. Pharaoh died as well. But I will admit, it made a very good scene with Yul Brynner returning back to Ramses and seeing his dead son and his wife reproaching him for the situation. Good scene in the movie, wrong historically. Everybody died in the sea. And apparently, judging from what I read in the account, Pharaoh didn't just bring part of his army, he brought them all. Egypt was helpless after this. Pharaoh was dead. The entire army was destroyed to a man and to a chariot. And this is, some people feel that this is one of the turning points in Egyptian history that the Egyptians don't record with any specificity. But you can kind of read between the lines and see it there. I'm not an Egyptologist, so I really can't cite you chapter and verse on that. Exodus 14, verse 30. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared Jehovah and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Now here's a place to stop and ponder something. I ask you the question, why was it necessary for Moses to hold out his hand over the sea to part it? Why was it necessary for Moses to put out his hand again to close it? Couldn't that have been done without Moses doing anything at all? Just standing there and looking at it as it takes place. My guess is that the purpose of this event was to establish Moses in their eyes. Because he said, when they saw all this, they put their trust in God and in Moses, his servant. It was very important, that this be established, that leadership be established, and this is how it was done, so that people would see it. Later there was a battle. Moses stood at the top of a hill over the battle with his arms raised. And whenever he put his arms up, Israel prevailed. When he put his arms down, their enemies prevailed. Why did that get done that way? Well, he got to the place to where he was too tired to hold his arms up. So they put a stone there. He sat on the stone. And Joshua and I believe Aaron stood by him and held his arms up. through their whole day so that Israel would prevail against their enemies. That man was crucial to this story. God intended that he be respected. He intended that he be admired. And more than anything else, trusted and followed. Because you get this kind of a gang of people together, and somebody is going to have to lead. Someone is going to have authority to lead. Someone is going to have to be followed. If you don't have that, you're going to have complete and total chaos. So, I think once again it was to establish Moses' authority. Now, I want you to come to the New Testament for an interesting corollary. It's in James, chapter 5, verse 14. James 5, verse 14. James writes, "Is there any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church. Let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of the faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up, and if he has committed sins, they shall be forgiven him." My question has been for a long, long time. Why do the elders have to enter this equation? Won't God hear your prayers? Won't God hear the prayers of your dad? Won't he hear the prayers of your children, your wife, your husband? Won't God hear the members of your church as they pray for you? Why is it that James says, let him call for the elders of the church, let them anoint him with oil, which is a step, that actually demonstrates the contact that's involved in this. And the prayer of faith shall save the sick. Well, God will certainly hear your prayers, but in any community of believers, there must be a seat of authority, a seat of leadership. And in Israel and in the church, that authority rests with elders. Are the elders always right? Hardly. Far, far from that. Do you have every right to examine those who are in authority over you to determine whether they have it or not? You bet you do. And there is this statement in Revelation chapter 2, verse 2. God says to the church at Ephesus, I know your works. I know your labor and your patience and how you can't stand those people who are evil. And you have tried them who say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. At no time are you ever relieved of the responsibility for evaluating what's going on around you. But when you know that the leader of the community is a godly man, you have an obligation to orient what you do around that leadership, to cooperate with the leadership, to try to make it work if you possibly can, to speak to the people concerned if you think they're in error and talk it over and see if you can't get it right. But somehow, some way, we have got to find a way of establishing not a hierarchy, but a seat of authority within a church, which generally always was historically among Israel and then later of the church, vested in elders. Men who have been around for a while, men who have not only gotten old, but have actually been invested with authority by the church to lead the church. I think, you look at these examples, they're here for a reason. And I think you can imagine with 2 million people wandering around the desert, you've got to have some very strong authority somewhere, or the whole thing gets lost. Revelation 2, this is said here. Now, when you know, as I said, a leader is a godly man, you have an obligation to orient what you're doing around that leadership and to cooperate. Never do you obey human leadership when it is contrary to the Word. That much I can say with confidence. And beyond that, you are always responsible for your own actions. If you stumble and fall because the leadership is leading in the wrong direction, guess who's going to get hurt? You are. And therefore, you can't go before God and say, well, I knew it was the wrong thing to do, but He told me to do it. That's not going to work. You're still responsible. Anyhow, when it comes to the community, someone has to lead, or the rest of us have to follow, or we're going to end up scattered all over the desert. But at any and at all points, this is voluntary. Any individual Israelite could have stayed in Egypt if he had wanted to. That option was available to them. Exodus 15, verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur, And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. Now, this puts us fairly close to today. I think, by no means certain, but I think we're not far at this point from the last day of unleavened bread. When they came to Marah, they couldn't drink of the waters of Marah because they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" He cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. He cast it into the waters were made sweet. And there he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. And this, I think, is fascinating. He said, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, condition number 1. If you will do what is right in his sight, condition number 2. And will give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, condition number 3. What then follows? I will put none of these diseases upon you which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that heals you. Now, this is really a striking statement when you consider the implications of it. Some time ago, I had a radio program where I talked about AIDS in Africa. And I listed off all the things and the reasons why it was, and how that any one, I think it was something like 5 or 7 different items out of the law of Moses. Any one of those laws followed by the people who were, the people in Africa, would have ended AIDS within a generation completely. Or if it had been followed in the first place, it never would have gotten a foothold at all. And I concluded in the program, well, what Africa needs is a good strong dose of the law of Moses. But without authority, it's not going to happen. Nevertheless, I began to see, though, from this, that in the law of God, there are so many laws that if you look at it, you think, I don't understand that law. Well, even though you don't understand it, it's very wise for you to stick with it in principle, not necessarily in the literal application, because you can't always do that. What you want to do when you see a law in the Old Testament you don't really understand is sit back, think about it for a while, and say, what is the underlying principle behind this law? Why was it so? Why was it needed? What's the lesson it learned? One of them is, of course, a man marries one woman, stays with her for life. That's one of the fundamental principles of God's law going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That law kept that man had sex with only one woman for all of his life, a woman had sex with only one man all of her life, would end humongous amounts of disease problems that we have in our society, including the dread killer AIDS. So that's just one example of the things that are there. There are the food laws. There are all these things that God lays out, most of which, I think virtually all of which, are fairly easy to do. How hard is it to avoid eating the foods that are specified that you're not supposed to eat in Leviticus? It's not that hard. Been doing it for a long, long time now. So there are all sorts of these things which pose no great problem for us if we do them. And a lot of times we simply don't know what's out there. There may be yet another shoe to drop that we have still not learned. Some Jews, I know, and I think some people who basically believe in the law of God, eat unclean meats because they believe the reason why they were given were purely health laws, and that now we know more than we did back then, and because of refrigeration and all this, they are not dangerous now. Well, they weren't. People had no idea of the danger involved in some of those things until what? 1500s, 1600s, when they first found out that there was a connection between trichinosis and pork. Somewhere in there. So before that time, that shoe had not dropped. But now it has. But my question is there another one to drop? Is there something else out there that we don't know about? Is there something to come? And how big a price is it to pay? Not that big. To me, this little thing at the waters of Marah that God says, look, just do it my way, and you can avoid the sickness, the disease, the plagues that go through these other nations around you, and you can be a healthy, a happy, a wholesome people. That's what this is all about. A marvelous idea to close out the Feast of Unleavened Bread. At Passover, we thought about the stripes of Christ, wherewith we are healed. And now we are promised that God's law is a way to health and well-being and happiness. Both ends of it. Christ makes it possible for us to be healed, to be forgiven. And this is a way of life that we walk in. And in that way of life, we end up in His presence with His joy. Exodus 15, verse 27, they came to Elim where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. And I presume this place, good fresh water, a nice place to be. Now there's an interesting little thing that follows on the heels of this. I won't take the time to work my way through it all. But what follows on the heels of this is a situation where the people start complaining about not having enough food to eat. They're really afraid they're going to run out and have to start killing their animals. And when they do that, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. So this is where God says, oh, relax. You know, Moses comes up and says, lighten up, everybody. There's going to be meat to eat tonight and bread in the morning. Okay, what they got that night was quail. By the thousands, apparently, came flying in. And so they had plenty of flesh to eat that night. In the morning, they got up and they found manna all over the ground. And what was interesting then about this, the law was laid out. The instructions were passed right out among the people. Okay. You go out and you gather 1 omer of that per person. You do not keep it over until the morning, because if you keep it over until the morning, it's going to breed worms and stink. So just get what you need for today. Tomorrow it will be here. Boy, what a lesson that is. You know, you live for the day. You have got to actually trust God to give it to you again tomorrow. This was the lesson which they had to learn, and the way they learned it was here. And so they did. And, of course, we had a saying in the Navy, there's always that 10% that doesn't get the word. And there were some of them that decided, I'll get a little bit extra. That way I won't have to get up so early in the morning and get it before it disappears. But he got up the next morning, it had bred worms, it stank like terrible, it had maggots in it, and that didn't work. So by the end of the week, they're all getting the picture now. You know, we can't keep this stuff over. But they'd been told now on the 6th day you can gather twice as much. And some of the people didn't do it. So they went out on the 7th day to find it. Nothing there. Nothing at all. And God says, when is a person going to listen to a person? You know, I told you what you had to do, and you still haven't got it. So they went hungry. That was not a terribly severe penalty to pay. You know, the lesson that I draw from that, to me, this is one of the really great ones. There are some things that we just got to do together, and we got to do them the same way. I remember one of the arguments way back was that, well, 1 day in 7 for the Sabbath. If I want to take Wednesday off and work the other days, that's just as good. No, it really isn't. Because in the observance of the Sabbath, you're doing 2 things. You are resting in solidarity with God, and you are resting in solidarity with one another, thereby keeping the burden off of everybody on the Sabbath day. So no, we don't get to decide on our own Sabbath day any more than those people got to decide on that Sabbath day. You know, this is a section of the Bible you just do really well to read and think about, because there are so many lessons that are interleaved in the historical narrative that these people had to learn them. They had to learn them the hard way. In some cases, they got killed in the process of learning them. If you can learn from it, it's just possible you could save yourself a whole lot of grief. One lesson I think that's very important and that we hold on to this day: stay together. Don't go wandering out in the desert by yourself.